Hello, my name is Rainer Hanekamp. I'm a trainer and consultant at Angular Architects, and this is a series about NgRx best practices. In this episode, we will deal with NgRx from an architectural perspective. So I'll present you with a blueprint of an architecture. We will pack all our NgRx related code into a module, and then we will see where we can put that module into our architecture. So why do we have to deal with architecture in the first place? I'm sure you can give me some arguments, but I want to mention my two favorite ones. They are stability and predictability and maintainability. So let's consider we have to make changes against the service. We want to find out what impact that change can have to our application. It can of course be the case that there is no impact at all, or that there is quite a huge one, depending how many parts of our application depend on that particular service. The answer is we just don't know, but with a good architecture that changes now, because with an architecture we split up our application code into several modules, and the modules, they encapsulate all the components, services that they have, so nobody from the outside can access them by default. Of course, that's not completely true. The module also exposes some parts of it, but then this also doesn't mean the end of the world, because there are also dependency rules in place, and they tell which modules can access our module and which not. Now, if we come back to that service that we want to change, if we see that this is a service which is only for the module's internal parts, it's very easy for us to verify that we don't break anything, because we just need to make sure that the module still works as before. Of course, this changes when we see that the service is also exposed, and then the question is, of course, what kind of module do we have here? Do we have a core module? If yes, that's the worst case, because then it would mean that quite a lot of parts of our application depend on it. If not, we are a little bit lucky. Nevertheless, we now know what impact we have and can spend our time appropriately. That's the advantage here. And now about the maintainability part. We also have the situation that our architecture, or that the modules within our architecture, they have a certain type according to their responsibilities. So we have types for NgRx, state management, and we also have types, for example, for presentational stuff. If I want to make now a change to a component, let's say I want to change the way a button reacts to a certain event, it is very clear for me how to do it and to find the right locations, because I don't just have the module types, the rules where they are placed. So in terms of the folder structure, of the naming convention and so on, that's very clearly defined. So if I say that my event handler is doing something in NgRx, I immediately know in which folder the NgRx module is and can do the changes. If I say, well, I just wanted that the button changes its layout, then it's also very clear for me, because there is also an own module type for the presentational stuff, and I need to go there and make the required change. So it's very easy for me to find the right locations, not just for me, but for the rest of the team. And even if a new team member enters, then it's also very easy, because I don't need to explain them my application line by line. I just need to explain the architecture, the rules, the conventions and so on. And then that person will also be very fast when it wants to start working on the code base. So how could such an architecture look like? I am presenting here the architecture which has been introduced by NX in their enterprise monorepository patterns, and we have extended it with domain-driven design. So the architecture itself, it consists of two levels, and at the first level we have our domain modules. So this is where we are applying domain-driven design, and this should allow us to cut the application, of course, into module groups, so to say so. And between these module groups, we want to have a minimal dependency. Of course, it would be perfect if there are no dependencies at all, but we can't avoid that all the time. We also have a shared module group. That one contains functionality that will be used by all our domain modules. Now let's zoom into the domain module itself. We find there 4 different module types with a hierarchy. This is an NgRx episode, so let's start with NgRx. So the NgRx part comes into the data module, that's clear. And then we have a feature and a UI module. And on the feature module, we find container components or smart components, how they are called. And in the UI module, we find the classic presentational or dump components. So what are the differences? Well, the container or the smart components, they are aware of the use case. They contain the logic. They know how to interact with NgRx. They know what should happen if a user presses a button and where to get the data from, how to prepare it for the presentational components. And as I already said, the presentational components, they are a specialist when it comes to rendering, to the layout. So they know how our website should look like, more or less. But they don't have no clue how the data comes from, what happens when a user presses on a button, and so on. What we also find, of course, in the container components is that they have a lot of TypeScript code, but very minimal HTML or CSS. In fact, they are just calling the presentational components. And on the presentational components, we have very few TypeScript, but a lot of HTML and CSS. So that's the interplay between these 2 module types. And on the bottom, you also see the module, very hard word to pronounce. That's a very small one, a very thin one, because it only contains the TypeScript interfaces for the domain models. That's all. One last thing are the access restrictions. As you see here, you have here arrows between the module types, and the UI module doesn't have access to the data module. That's simply forbidden. It should not be possible that any UI component is able to inject the store and to dispatch actions or to select something from the state. This falls into the responsibility of our container components, and that's why we have created a separate module for them. And if we apply NX, so not just using the normal Angular CLI, but the NX extensions, it is also possible to enforce these access restrictions. So we have a linter which we can run automatically, and it will tell us if an access violation has happened or not. Well, and now let's come to the actual implementation and see how this is done. So this is our application that we have. We have here a customers menu item. When I click on it, I'm getting the customers list, which is presented by the customers component. And if I click on an item, I'm getting into the detail screen, and this one is the customer component. Both components are getting their data from NgRx. If we switch back to our code, then we see here that the customer components and NgRx are all part of the customer module in Angular. This is already a module, but not a real one. It's just an Angular module, and it is still part of an application. In order to make a real module out of it, we need to create a library. And I do this by running the command npx ng and generate library. And what I will do now is that I create 4 modules, 4 submodules for the domain customers that I have already presented. And these are the feature module, which will contain the container components, the UI module with the presentational components, the data module that contains all the NgRx related stuff, and in the end the model module, which only contains the TypeScript interfaces. So I say ng-generate library and feature directory customer. And I will execute this code for the rest 3 modules as well. Okay, now we are done. If we click on libs, we see that we have here a customer folder, and inside of that customer folder we find the data, the feature, the model and the UI lib or the modules. So the next step for me would be that I move all the code that lies now in the app, in the application, to these libs. And I will start with the model module itself, which means I will use or I will pick the customer interface and move it to that model module. So that is located here. Open it and I move it there. The next thing, I need to expose this customer interface from that module to the outside. And the way how this is done is via the index.ts file. So in the index.ts file I can define which parts that module wants to export or wants to expose. And in this case I just say I want to export the customer module at the customer interface. And what I don't need is the Angular module. So I don't need the customer model module anymore, because this is just an Angular module and the model only contains your TypeScript interfaces. So there is no real need for an Angular module there. The next step is that I also move the NgRx code into the data module. Goes the same thing as I did before. So I'm selecting these elements and I'm moving the files down here. Okay. And what I have to do now is that first of all I need to fix all the imports, because the imports are now the wrong ones. The customer is not anymore in the same location as the customer actions, more or less, so they are not part of the application of the app module anymore, of the customer Angular module anymore. And that's why I need to remove this import here, and I need to do another refresh import. And we see here already how the new import looks like. It says it is coming, the customer interface is coming from the customer model module. That's now the new path. And now I need to fix all the other customer imports that I have in my NgRx code here as well. Okay, so I have fixed all the imports. So the next part for me would be that I define what elements should be exposed by the customer data module. And since this is an NgRx related module, we already know what we want to expose. We want to expose parts of our selectors and also parts of our actions. Let's start with the actions. So I go into the customer actions file, and at the end I create a new const where I say these are the public customer actions, because I don't want to expose all actions that exist here. I only want to expose the actions that should be dispatchable by our components. And this means I expose the get, I expose the add, the update and the remove, but not the other ones. And now I go into the index.ts And here I say I want to export the public customer actions from the actions file. And I don't want to call it public customer actions, I just want to call it customer actions so that from the outside, or the modules that want to use it, they still can call that one customer actions. And the next thing that I want to export are the selectors, and here it's fine if I just export all of them. Okay, so far for the NgRx module or for the data module, and now comes the rest. Now comes the feature module. And for the feature module, I will just copy everything that's left here and move it into the lab folder. I can remove the customer feature module because we have also copied the customer module. So that's already here. And what I have to do now is that I have now to fix the input statements in the same way as I did before in the data module. Yeah. So we also see here that we are importing parts of NgRx, and this will also change now. So first of all, I will not export the customer app state anymore, or it is not exported, so I can only inject here the store itself, but I have access to the selectors, so there is already some type safety, because I should always use the selectors when I'm doing selects from my store. So this is the selector, and we will see here that the import from customer is done from the eternal customer data module. And now I continue with fixing the missing or the rest of the import commands. So we are almost done with the refactoring. I will later on create the UI module. This is a separate step, but for now, how are we going to deal with the customer module itself? Do we need to change here anything? Well, not really. Everything is already set up in the right way. The only thing that we maybe should do is that we move the store and the effects module to our data module. That would make sense. So I'm going into the data module itself, and here in the imports, I am importing the store and the effects module. And of course, what I need to do now is that the customer module is importing the customer data module, because otherwise the store would not be instantiated. Since we have moved the customer module, we also need to update the import in the app module itself. And we see here how IntelliJ did the import. It was using a deep link. And why did it do that? Well, the reason is that our customer feature module is not exporting the customer module. This is what I need to change, and then I can retry the import. So in the index.ts, we see that we are exporting the wrong module. Here I just say export from and then we will retry it again. And now we see that the right import has been used. It's eternal customer feature. That's the right way how to import modules. Now let's take a look at that encapsulation feature. So what happens, or how do we prevent that we can import or we can use a deep import as I just did? Let's just say in my customers component, I want to import the customer app state that I have just removed. So I'm saying here, I want to use the customer app state. It is possible, it is again a deep import. What will happen now? Well, when we are now running the linting against this module, then we will see that we are getting a linting error. We see here that the linting error, there is one problem which says libraries cannot be imported by a relative or absolute path. We always need to use the module name. If that's not possible, then this means that in this case the customer app state is not exposed to the outside, and that's why we can't use it. So I just need to remove it. I need to rerun the lint, and now we will see that everything is fine. By the way, if you're using Angular CLI, you can of course also generate libraries, but the Angular CLI will not give you the linting rules that you require to verify that you don't have any deep imports and that you can really come up with a module encapsulation. The same is also true for the access rules, which I will show after we have created the UI module. So let's check if our application can be started. Okay, compilation went through, looks quite good. We reload the page, we click on customers, everything is there. So now to the final step, to the UI module. As I said before, what we will do now is that I will split up the customers and the customer component into two parts. The part which will contain the logic, the TypeScript code, stays in the feature module. That's a so-called container component. And the part that is responsible for the rendering is the UI part, or is the presentational component, and that comes into the UI module. So the first task that I have to do is that I have to rename the existing components, and I call them container components. So the customer component becomes a customer container component. And the same is true for the customers component. And now I generate two further components inside of the UI module. I call it the customers component and say the project is customer UI. And I do the same for the customer component. And now about the refactoring. So the customer containers, let's start with the customers component. That one has here the logic, so it is injecting the store. It is also doing the selection. That part stays within the container component. The HTML part and also the CSS, that goes into the UI component. So I'm scrolling down to the UI module. I open the customers component there, and I just copy the HTML and the CSS into these files. Now we are inside of the UI component. The UI component does not have to deal with any observable because it is already getting the customers via its input decorator. So that's why I can remove this part here. Of course, I also need to import the required modules, which is in this case the router module and also the mat icon module. And then, as I said before, the customers will now become a property with an input decorator. And I don't need the constructor or the ng in it. It is simply not required. And now I need to go back into my container component. I can more or less remove the style sheet, so the CSS, and I can also do template inlining because the HTML of the container component is very minimal. So everything that I need to do now inside of my template is that I just call the presentational component, which is eternal customers, and of course I need to pass the customers property to it. What is missing? Well, the Angular module of the UI module needs to export, of course, its customers component, otherwise it can't be used. And the feature or the feature module of customers needs to import the UI module, of course. Exports has already been done by IntelliJ, and the import as well. So more or less we should be done by now. Let's check if the application is still running. Wonderful, the application is still working. The last thing that we need are the access rules. So what we want to avoid that the UI component, or that any component in the UI module can access our state. At the moment it would be possible that I have a constructor, that one is injecting the store, and it could just say, well, store select from customer all my customers. I can also do a subscription if I want, and I just say, well, I just assign it to my customers property. And now I don't need the feature module at all. My UI components can again do everything on their own. And this is something that we want to avoid, because we did this split up in the first case, that UI components don't need to know about all the logic. This is all located in the container components. So how can we prevent this? Yeah, it's very easy. We just need to set up the right access rules. And for that, two steps are required. The first one is that we need to tag our projects. And for that, we need to go into the NX file, NX.json file. So we see here a list of all our projects, and we need to assign tags to it. We will assign 2 tags to each project. One tag will define the domain, the other tag will define the module type. And based on the domain and the module type, we will implement the access restrictions. So the customer data gets the domain customer, and it is of type data. And I'm doing the same for the rest of the modules. The eternal itself is the application. There is one exception to the rule, because it just only gets one tag, which is the app tag. And now I go into the linting rules, and there I will define which modules can access which modules by using the tag values that I have just assigned. by default, as we see here, everything can depend on everything. And this is something that we need to change. So we say that the app, everything which is an app, which is at the moment only one, the internal project itself, can only depend on type feature. That's required because it needs to import, of course, the customer feature module. And then we define the access rules for a type feature module. So for type feature module, it's very easy because they can depend on all other types. The UI and the data modules, they can only depend on the model type, but not on the feature or vice versa, because this is exactly what we want to avoid. We don't want that the UI module can access something from our data type modules. What about type model? Well, the type model type modules can't depend on anything, so we don't have to add an entry. What we also have to add is the rules depending on the domain. So what we say here, that every customer domain only has access to another module which is of the same domain. That's it for the access rules, and now we need to verify that the UI module can't access our data module anymore. For that, I will go back into the customers component, and there I will retry, or I will run the linting rules and check if I am getting a violation because I'm using the selector of the data module. So this is the customers component. We see here that it is using from customer select all. If we take a look at the import, we see that it is importing from the customer data module, which is a clear violation against the rules that we have just implemented. And this is now what we want to verify. And we are getting one error. And it says here in line 2, which is the import, that this is a module of type UI and it can only depend on a type of module, but no other module. So we just need to remove it, rerun the linting, and hope that there are no further errors. And that's it. So we have achieved a split up of our customer module into 4 different domain modules or libraries, as the right technical term here is used. We have also introduced module encapsulation via the index.ts file, and we have also created access rules with the combination of the NX.json file and the ESLint file. And by using NX, of course, we have the linting rules in place, which can automatically detect if a violation happened or not. One last thing about the UI module. Quite often you hear that the UI module is part of the shared module group. That's true, of course, because we always should try to come up with generic UI components. Nevertheless, there are 2 reasons why you also want to have additional UI modules inside of a domain module group. The first reason is that you have a UI component which is very domain specific. Let's say you have an input in that component, and that input gets a type of the domain model. Now, of course, you can't put that component into the shared module. It needs to be part of the domain module. That's the first reason. And the second one is a very pragmatic one. If you want to split up a large component into several pieces, then the split up into a container and a presentational component is something which gives you a very quick result, because now you can say, okay, I'm putting all my TypeScript code into the container component, and the rest, the presentational part, comes into the UI component. So this is already a very significant reduction that you can apply quite often. And that's it for this episode. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have ideas about an episode, so like a topic or something, please let me know. You can write me on Twitter or just add a comment to that video. Please subscribe, and other than that, I wish you a good time, and until next episode. See you.